Hello and welcome to Office of Harbour. It is a cold and dreary winter August day now, and we're talking about the books of July, and they are also pretty great, I'll be honest. And sadly I didn't really get anything that was truly amazing this month, but they are still kind of worthwhile. The only kind of bright spot in this is that we do get to go to a lot of different countries across all of these books, so hopefully I can talk about that well, do that justice, we'll see. Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. So this is the beginning of my quest to read a lot of Henry James in preparation for this new syllabus that requires Extension 2 students to focus on an author, Henry James being one of the three, and probably the representative of like classic American English canon literature. This is an American author who moved over to London and wrote a lot of novels set around that era and place. Portrait of a Lady is kind of in the midpoint. So Henry James kind of started out writing social realism. I would say his work initially feels quite similar to people like Thomas Hardy, almost a little bit of Charles Dickens, like late Charles Dickens, and then develops into a much more experimental and thematic lens, so much more comparable with authors like D.H. Lawrence. And so by chronicling this kind of change over time, Henry James is a pretty interesting person to study, even though his works, I think for the entirety of his career, tend to be more on the literary end. Like even The Turn of the Screw, which is a ghost story, is meant to be exciting, is still a bit slow and still kind of infamously one of those books that high school kids do not like. But The Portrait of a Lady is long, and it's kind of in between this transformation between Victorian era sensibilities and modernist experimentation. To my mind, it kind of has the worst of both worlds. Like, it has like the very overbearing detail of a Victorian novel, but it also has the opaqueness of a modernist novel, and you feel like you're kind of working when you read it. It doesn't feel, well, it does feel a bit relaxing, but it doesn't feel like it's taking you anywhere. Instead, I felt like I had to put in quite a bit of work to get something out of this. The sentences are very long, the characters are complicated, everyone's kind of trying to deceive each other as well, and it's trying to make these really big and lofty statements about social class and about society, about men and women, and all of these ideas are pretty interesting, but ultimately, it's not the kind of book that you would just pick up in an afternoon to enjoy. So, I will talk pretty much the entirety of the plot, because not that much happens. Don't feel bad about spoiling a novel this old, but even if I was just to describe the plot, I don't think I would be giving an accurate representation of what reading this book is actually like. So the plot is about a young woman who inherits a lot of money from her family while she's still single, and she rejects two potential suitors and eventually marries a person who is effectively scamming or conning her. This relationship doesn't go very well. She feels really constrained and constricted. She can't make a decision about what she wants to do, but she puts all of her hope and effort into making sure that her stepdaughter, so the daughter of the previous marriage that her husband has, making sure that she doesn't make the same mistake that the protagonist does. This is not really the main point, and I would argue that so many chapters in this book often feel like they are muddling up this core narrative. There are chapters where characters kind of just talk to each other, conversations last for a really long time in this book, and it doesn't feel like the plot's really advancing. We do get these surprisingly interesting moments where we get characters talking about what it means to be a wife, or what it means to be a husband. What does it mean to love across all of these European cultures? Core to this narrative is that our protagonist travels a lot with the money that she has. She goes to Italy and goes to France, and in each of these environments, there's various conversations about what a relationship looks like and means in these different cultures. She also meets people that are coming from America that are also very different in their values, and the preciseness that is delivered here in this period of history when the world is just starting to globalize and people are starting to interact more with one another, and yet it isn't this kind of homogenized Western culture where we kind of assume that we all believe the same thing if we're from the UK or from the US or from Australia. This is, I think, where this novel's strength today lies, and where it's probably pretty interesting, and it's the kind of thing that would make me want to write an essay, but not really enjoy my time with it. Like, I feel like I could say some stuff about it if I really wanted to pay attention. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. I would give it, honestly, a 3 out of 5. I think in terms of readability, this book is not that good. The core kind of deceit narrative could have been enjoyable and it really isn't. Of course, I don't mean to dump on the book's historical, literary significance. Like, there is a lot of effort that's gone into this. It is carefully written in a very detailed way, and depending on how you view the function of literature, if you view it through a very modernist lens of how well does it actually communicate societal beliefs and values, how well does it actually show what life really is like for the people there, and how much is it novelly experimenting with ideas of characterization and setting and plots, then this novel does become a whole lot better. But I would also hazard that most people aren't going to be reading like that today. So that's a kind of caveat. I'm not saying it's a bad book, but I am saying that its relevance today is pretty limited, and the ability of someone, I would like to think of myself as an average reader, the ability of an average reader to enjoy it is not that high. That's kind of where I get this ranking from. Okay, let's talk about bad books. So for my something light is Mergers and Acquisitions by Dana Vachon. Interestingly, he's written a sort of auto-fictive novel with Jim Carrey, and that novel's done really well recently. But this is his debut novel. He was a investment banker with JP Morgan, and it is very roughly converted to J.S. Spencer in this book. It is a book about young rich capitalists working for an investment bank and just doing the silly debauchery things that you would expect people of that stature to do. And it's not good. It's one of those books where I feel really weird talking about it. I can't even find it on Goodreads or Storygraph, which I'm using, because so few people have really read it or talked about it. It is a bit older than those platforms, and it was traditionally published, but probably in like a limited print. I'm actually a bit confused as to how I managed to pick this up in a used bookstore in Australia. I don't really know how these things work, but this is an argument against picking up any random book at a used bookstore and just picking up and reading it, because you may find gems, you may also find things that are just kind of okay. And this book, to me, is one that has a very clear mission and does achieve that mission, but the results that you get is distasteful. We have this protagonist who is a little bit morally bankrupt. He's a bit emotionally disaffected. He has this younger brother who passed away because of a peanut allergy at a rich prep school. And he earns his job at J.S. Spencer through his dad's nepotism. He doesn't really believe anything, he just wants to make a lot of money, and he doesn't really care about anybody around him, or morality, or societal benefits, or anything like that. He's just kind of going to ride the coattails of finance and get as much money as he can. This book came out, I think, a year before the GFC, and so me imagining the kind of immoral behavior that would exist in these big investment firms kind of mirrors what I'm reading here. And although the author has lived this experience, or at least worked in these kinds of environments, it does still feel exaggerated. It does feel like the characters are behaving the way that I would expect them to behave right before this big financial crash. And it means that no one comes away feeling good. Everyone gets very thoroughly roasted, but there is also not really a moral judgment being made, other than the fact that these people are bad. The protagonist is bad. His best friend, Robert Thorne, is awful, like genuinely terrible, a really, really bad person, and manages to succeed the whole way through. Women also get treated really, really badly in this novel, not just in a kind of misogynist sense, although that's definitely there, but also the people that do end up in long-term relationships with these main men get treated terribly, and their emotions are toyed with and played with, and I would say it's tragic, except that they are also deconstructed and criticized to a high degree as well. It's a really kind of blistering and scathing novel, but it doesn't do it from any kind of moral high ground. Instead, it just portrays characters behaving badly, seemingly in the hope that the audience will dislike them. And that style of kind of hate read is what I think this novel's trying to get at. It doesn't really bring anybody to a turning point or an epiphany or anything. It's much more just these people are being bad, and each subsequent chapter is kind of like a descent further down into how bad can you get in these environments, how many people will die, how many people will get addicted to things, or terribly, terribly hurt somebody else, or just completely tread on someone else's emotions. Like, all these bad things that will continue to happen, how it's hard to talk about because I just really didn't like this novel very much. I would give it a 1 out of 5 for just how much I would rather to have read literally anything else. And it reminds me too, it really kind of teaches me about American literature in that Catcher in the Rye is an important book, but a lot of books have kind of rode those coattails of having an unlikable protagonist giving their own personal monologue, going through, in both cases, New York, but really some kind of metropolitan environment, not really fitting in and committing various sorts of crimes or misdemeanors, and then at the end, we're just like, oh, this guy, right? Catcher in the Rye, I thought, did it pretty well. It had this kind of moment of hope or possible redemption, and we had a much younger character who had his life ahead of him, whereas I don't really see anybody in this novel going anywhere after this. I think by the time I put the book down, I was like, I don't want to know about these people anymore. They might as well not exist, which is not really a feeling you want to get at the end of the book. It feels mean giving it a 1 star, but it also is... What else am I going to give it 1 star to, right? Like, what else this year has made me feel this distasteful towards its characters, towards themes, and towards everything? Don't read this. Of course, don't read this. Book number 3, The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida. This is a sort of magic realism text about the Sri Lankan Civil War and about a photographer who is killed but doesn't know how he died, and he finds himself in this middle ground between the afterlife and this world, where he's kind of like a ghost. He can haunt people, he can have slight amounts of influence among certain people, and he has this quest of the photographs that he took of events in the Sri Lankan Civil War. What he believes these photographs could do is reveal how he died and who killed him, but also potentially create a international awareness of the events that happened and possibly bring about peace or justice in some way. And so we have this really well-constructed quest through these 7 days in this world where there's recently deceased people, there's ghosts, and there's spiritual beings as well. There are different factions within this ghost world that believe this ghost world is here for certain purposes, like whether it's here for atonement or whether it's here for revenge. Is it some way that people who have passed away because of rival armies and rival ideologies, is it a way that those people can get back at them? And it's just really well constructed. It's this incredible mystery arc that runs through this text where there's multiple questions that are left unanswered. We have our protagonist friends when he was alive, so we have his romantic partner and we have his female friend that he lives with, and there's these different questions of loyalty and values. All 3 of them, for various reasons, are kind of at odds with larger Sri Lankan society. And then we also have this motif of gambling. We have him living at this hotel which contains a big casino. He gambles away a lot of the earnings he makes by taking photographs and selling those photographs to various organizations, aid organizations, newspapers, armies, all of these things. We get this picture of a protagonist who in life wasn't so much of a hero as he was kind of often in the right place at the right time, and did still have quite a stern sense of justice. And then in his afterlife, he needs to make these decisions about who he will support and what his life really means, what he believes this war to be about, and how he's going to interact with his old friends and his family. Really this opportunity to look back on one's life and decide what did it all mean, what will come out of this. It's well constructed, and I'm surprised that there are this many afterlife stories in the Booker Prize winners. So I'm reading this for my something spooky category because it's a novel about ghosts, but it is also a Booker Prize winning novel. I am trying so hard to finish these books so I can never read anything from this prize again. But I think it's working well. I think it's an effective novel, and it is a much more compelling read than a lot of other things that have won this prize so far. I think it's a very deserving winner, and I would give it a 4 out of 5. I can remind myself that these rankings, these ratings, are not kind of like the percentage of goodness I think a book is. It's more just kind of where I categorize it in my mind for how much I liked it, how much I think I'll remember it, and how they kind of stack up to my favorites. This is one of those novels where I think everything is effective, meaningful. I thought it was a really edifying experience reading the whole thing, and it'll kind of go back on my shelf I don't know if I'll bring it back out. Yeah. The Booker Prize winning novel this month that I chose to read for its prize winning status is The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Richard Flanagan. This is, I want to say, the last Australian Booker Prize winner that I will read for this challenge. I could be wrong, but this is a Tasmanian author, and he's writing about the Death Railroad, so from Indonesia all the way through now Myanmar and across China and Japan, that was built towards the end of World War II in the Pacific Theatre. He's building on his father's memories of being a POW in that environment. He's creating fictional characters that have gone through this. And it's a surprisingly complex look at this period of history, at this period of this war. So I've read quite a few World War II novels now, and most of them have been centered around Europe. I have read a few that are in the Pacific Theatre. I think the one that I remember the most right now is A Town Called Alice, and I did not like that book. This book, I do like, but I'm really conflicted on how I feel about it. So at this point, I think that the war novel with a weird sex story back home is a bit of a type. So I'm thinking of novels, and I know that both of these are World War I, but I'm thinking about, are they actually? I'm thinking about Atonement, which I think is World War II actually, and I'm thinking about Birdsong, and I'm thinking about these novels as ones with a romance subplot that, to me, felt unnecessary and kind of gross, paired with this novel about the horrors of war and going to combat and being a young man in this horrible period of history, and being really split on how I think these novels worked. This novel is kind of the same. So we follow Dorobo Evans. He is a soldier that's for a period of time stationed in South Australia, and there he meets his uncle, and so his uncle's partner, not blood relatives, he begins a sexual relationship with her. This is weird, and in the beginning of the novel, I was kind of worried because I was recognizing this novel to be part of that type, but I think what Flanagan does is that he recognized the whole way through that this is not a good relationship, and this is not a correct, there's a lot of things going wrong here. And so that tinges these passages of romance and sexual desire because the reader is clued into the fact that, this is bad, this is wrong. And so he's carrying this to the war. It's told in this really non-linear style. We get lots of jumps back and forth to his past, and then to the actual war fronts, or building the railroad, the POW camp, and then the aftermath of that. Really, it's 3 timelines, and they all kind of move forward, but we just switch between these 3 timelines. So it's not so difficult to piece together, and we do have moments where we kind of jump unexpectedly, but it's always going forward. It's never jumbled up, and you never need to piece things together. I think that this structure works because it leads to a really, really good ending. I think the way this novel ends put everything in place so well that it makes the rest of the novel worth it, in a sense. I think the way that they've tied together these 3 lines. So what's interesting to me about this novel too is that it is, I don't want to say weirdly, but respectfully sympathetic of the Japanese soldiers. And I'm not talking about this as someone who, I'm Chinese, I have my cultural connection to this part of the war in a way that I'm not culturally connected to the European front in World War I and World War II. This period of history, also being Australian, but immediately before this period of history was the Japanese invasion of China. And so these kinds of discussions are a little bit more relevant to me and my grandparents and my ancestry. I thought that the representation of the Japanese soldiers and their desire to fight, and also their reputation for being really ruthless and really cruel towards not only POWs, but also their own soldiers that don't really align with their values, is well displayed here. But that's balanced against the humanity of these characters, that each one of these soldiers and commanders is still a human being, and that after the war, a lot of them did go back to ordinary life if they didn't pass away in fighting. I think it's done in a really interesting way, especially because, And this isn't for lack of trying, but I've not been able to read an actual Japanese perspective on the war. So Richard Flanagan, I think, having read also Question 7, is a writer that I trust a lot more to do their research properly and to write in a respectable, or at least like a responsible way, these other cultures, than many other war novelists that I could describe. I think that this book does feel really well researched. It does have elements of his personal familial history. It also has a First Nations character, and their representation to me is... It's so hard for me to say as someone who is not First Nations, because Richard Flanagan has talked about it in Question 7, about how he is very connected to First Nations people. In the history of Tasmania, there is the genocide and erasure of First Nations people. So he's talking about the very real possibility that he is partially First Nations, and yet he would never claim that because he doesn't have that certainty or that connection. That complexity does work its way into the representation of this First Nation characters here, because I think it's done in a sadly realistic way. He is discriminated against really strongly, and he's referred to by his race and not by his name, but he also suffers the kind of humiliation that really everyone did in this PW camp. Everyone, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of what they think is important or what they think is right, they're all struggling through the construction of this railway. And it's a hard read, and I think the choice to portray reality rather than avoid the more uncomfortable side of things, I guess works. I don't really know if I can give more explanation beyond that, but I think everyone who reads will probably have their own interpretation of this. The last thing I'll say, though, is that this is one of those novels that I feel like Australian culture is making into this kind of great Australian novel thing. So Oscar and Lucinda was one, this is one, the Dictionary of Lost Words is one of those novels that talks about national history and parts of our cultural identity. And so I do feel like the comprehensiveness of these characters at war is an attempt to do this. I don't know if I would champion this as the #1 Australian novel. I don't know if I've found that yet, but there are candidates that I will put above this. But it is something to be aware of, having read this, is that it does feel like that's what's trying to happen here. Ultimately, I think it's quite well done. I think the way that it uses all of its various motifs, I think the way that the morality is grey in a really good sense. No one's kind of a paragon of goodness, and no one's someone that you really want to cheer about, and yet when we experience these characters suffering, we do feel it, and we do want to see them survive and recover. It produces a really strong emotional response, and I think it does it really well. The prose is well constructed as well, the pacing is really good. There isn't a lot of complaints that I would have about this book compared to a lot of the other war novels that I've read. I would give it a 4 out of 5. I think it's a very effective book. It maturely treats this period of history in a way that I think less and less books will do going forward. I think there's this trend of World War II novels using the war as a backdrop for a black and white morality adventure story. Things like All the Light We Cannot See, doing that. The Narrows of the Deep North does feel like a representation of humanity in all parts of this conflict. The Japanese characters, the Korean character who was conscripted as part of the Japanese occupation of Korea, the Australian characters, the Indonesian characters. I think that this author has been, if not perfectly successful, then at least very, very well-meaning and very thorough in the way that he writes. So I think ultimately I would recommend this, and I come away with a more positive feeling than many other war novels I've read. Okay, yearly challenge. This one I'm slightly cheating because, yes, this novel was published as a serial a few years prior, but I'm using the year that the actual collection was bound and sold as a single novel. A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the author who wrote Tarzan, and the book that eventually became that movie John Carter that people didn't go see in cinemas. This is not good. It's a romance in the sense that it's the genre of romance that doesn't exist anymore. It is a story of one individual going off into this far-off land or territory. In this case, it's Mars, but in the 1800s, very popularly would be going off to the high seas or going off to some other culture, and then having an adventure there, defeating evil, getting the girl, doing that kind of generic action adventure story plot. And Edgar Rice Burroughs was a genetic racist, and he believed in the superiority of white people, and that's very, very apparent in the way that this novel is written. So we have our protagonist, who is a Confederate veteran. He is off hunting, and he's off to go attack some Apache Native Americans. He ends up in a cave and somehow finds himself on Mars. The novel is very much just don't think about it. I think the phrase used is something like, he knew for certain that he was on Mars, and that's it. And it's not really a novel about Mars or about Martians, really. It's a novel about first contact. And what we find is that our protagonist is just a really strong, cool dude. Like, he's someone who effortlessly kills Martians with his bare hands because of the explanation that the gravity on Earth is stronger than the gravity on Mars, so he's basically a superhuman when he goes to Mars. Martians are portrayed as this warlike and factional group. There's different races and different cultures that have conflicts based on their skin color, and he just kind of tears through everything. So he finds the culture like weirdly misogynistic, and so he rescues this captured princess from an opposing tribe, and he just kills his way through society in order to make sure that she's safe, but also he gets to marry her. He's told of all these various customs and traits, and his first thought is basically, how can I circumvent these in order to get what I want? How can I... And even this description is done in a quite derogatory way. Like, these Martian people are portrayed as backwards and savage, and each of the cultural practices are things that the narrator first doesn't understand, but also is able to pay service to just so he can circumvent them. He also learns the language, like, shockingly quickly. He learns how to speak Martian, and eloquently speak Martian, in 2 days, from nothing. It's just a lot of, like, don't think about it, our protagonist is superior, so watch him fight some dudes kind of story. And in this day and age, that's just not really what we want anymore. I don't think that many people are cruising for a story like this. I would like to hope that morality is a bit more complex in our representations of even adventure stories. Like, we want to believe in the humanity of other people. We don't want to look at another culture. Yes, here there are Martians, but every contact narrative is really about humans, right? We don't want to ever look at a culture of people who are different to us and go, how can we exploit the people for that as much as I can get? That's just a totally ridiculous worldview for me, and hopefully all other readers. And so this book is something that I would hope remains as just a historical curio and nothing else. You can't really buy this in stores, which I'm kind of glad about. It's not one of those books people kind of defend and celebrate and say, hey, I read this as a kid and I really like it. I think the representations of traveling to Mars, meeting a new culture, that feeling of wonder, is sort of there, and it just doesn't feel like it cares enough about meeting this other culture. It cares so much more about making its protagonists look strong and win than it does about actually revealing what Martian culture is like and how they're different from Earth culture. So for that, I think I enjoyed the book less than, well, almost everything else this year, almost everything else this month, but also less than what I wanted out of it. I think that the contact narrative, even as it is kind of birthed out of books like this, the contact narrative is so much more varied and interesting. There are so many more novels that circumvent the problems, that dodge the problems that I'm talking about with this one. So don't read this, read those. This is a 1 out of 5. We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a novel that I read because I wanted to, because I think Kazuo Ishiguro for me is a kind of comfort read. He has a style that's always very recognizable. He's always got a first-person narrator that's usually a pretty old person looking back on his life and the choices that they made. This one is a sort of detective novel. The other thing that's distinct about his works is that ever since The Remains of the Day, each novel is a slightly different genre. So Remains of the Day being historical fiction, When We Were Orphans being a detective novel, Never Let Me Go being science fiction, The Buried Giant being fantasy. Each one tells this same story about an older person looking back on the life and the choices they made and being kind of unreliable narrator. Each story also reflecting on notions of memory, how we remember things, and how we might change our memories depending on the kind of people that we are. Each one is just kind of told in a different shell. And so this one being a detective story shell and being set in Shanghai in the 1930s, I thought I would really enjoy. Unfortunately, I would say it's probably the worst of the Ishiguro novels I've read. And it's also one that he himself kind of doesn't love. We have our narrator who reflects on his growing up in Shanghai, being the neighbor and friend of a Japanese boy named Akira, and growing up and not really understanding what was going on around him. China, meanwhile, at this period, being immensely complex politically. We have the western quarter of Shanghai, which is where our Londoner narrator grows up. And we have this conflict between his parents and what values they represent with wider China amidst the Opium War, amidst English people really exploiting China for their economy by selling opium to this country and really devastating the Chinese population. It got to the point where the whole Chinese side of Shanghai was seen as this kind of like no-go zone. Like, it's very dangerous there. And we have this mystery where the protagonist's parents go missing. And he doesn't really know how or why that happened, but he has this inkling that it happened because of these opium wars and because of their role in trying to get London to stop selling opium to China. He thinks that various political groups have kidnapped them and held them for ransom. And so with this, he's ferried off to London by his uncle. He becomes a detective there, and then many, like almost 25 years later, he goes back to Shanghai because of a woman that he's met, that she's moved over there with her husband, and he kind of follows along. He gets deluded into thinking that if he solves the mystery of where his parents are, then everything will be fixed. Like the impending invasion of China by Japan, the current invasion of China by Japan, all of the forthcoming World War II problems, like all of that will be fixed if he can just find his parents. And so we have this mystery that's not really a mystery, because I think the reader the entire way through, I mean, this is what I was thinking, this is clearly ridiculous. Like, there is no possible way that our narrator is going to find his parents still ransomed in the same house they were 15 years ago. That's totally ridiculous. And I think this realization of delusion is also present in The Remains of the Day and also The Artist of the Floating World, but I think in both of those novels, the delusion is kind of more believable as to why someone would really think this is true, and also we discover it quite gradually with our narrator, whose voice we kind of like. And in this novel, the trick is just not quite as powerful. I think the audience is a more fraught relationship with the narrator because he starts off a lot more unreliable than the other works that Ishiguro has done to this point. And it just kind of goes off the rails from there. I think the fun of reading a work like this is always trying to figure out what the reality is when the only access we get to the story is a narrator that we can't trust. So towards the end, this does start working. You do get scenes where it feels like you're reading two books at once. You're trying to see the real story, but you're also trying to see his story, trying to figure out why he is the way he is. That does work. But it does require setting aside a lot of assumptions and historical knowledge about England and China at this time in order to have this fun detective mystery story play out. And it just didn't work for me quite as well as some of the other novels did. I would give this a 3 out of 5. Not his best work. Lastly, for Shakespeare, Pericles, Prince of Tyre is, I guess, a comedy and a very, very strange play. So this is another very international story. We have Pericles, who's from Phoenicia in now modern-day Lebanon. He goes to a Greek city. He goes to a Greek city because he's heard a rumor that a king has a daughter who's basically the heir to the kingdom and unmarried. And so he goes there and participates in the stupid marriage challenge that's really present in a lot of Shakespearean comedies. So the king has devised this riddle to all people that will want to marry his daughter. And if they figure out the riddle, they get to marry her. And if they don't get the answer correct, then they're murdered. And there's this like incredibly metal stage direction where it's basically like points to skulls on top of the stage or whatever as representative of all the people that previously tried this riddle and didn't succeed. So Pericles hears the riddle, and here is where, and this is Act 1, Scene 1, here's where things get like absolutely bananas weird. This is a play that's narrated by John Gower, who is a real poet from about a century from before Shakespeare, and so it's kind of a story within a story. The narration tells us that what's happened is that this king has had a sexual relationship with his daughter, and this is, well, horrible, terrible thing, and is hidden away from all society, but the content of his riddle reveals the fact that this incestuous relationship took place. Why you would do that, I have no clue. I don't understand. It's so ridiculous to me. But Pericles basically figures it out. He listens to the incredibly obvious riddle of the story of this awful relationship, and he realizes. And he's about to tell the king, and then he realizes that if he knows the truth of this relationship, then he's going to get killed, because of course they would want to silence him. And if he gets the answer wrong, he's going to get killed because he got the stupid riddle game wrong. And so, realizing that there's death on either side, he asks for a postponement. The king grants it, and then Pericles just runs. The king sends an assassin after Pericles, and this is the end of Act 1. It's just such a silly, silly play. So, in Act 2, Pericles realizes that there's an assassin after him. He decides to run away from Tyre, and he leaves his friend Heliodorus, or something like that, in charge of the kingdom. At this point, we get these really familiar plot elements from previous Shakespeare plays. So we have the marriage riddle from The Merchant of Venice. We have leaving your kingdom in the hands of somebody else, which reminds me of Measure for Measure, and also The Tempest. Some of these might have been after this play. And we get these kind of familiar things. And I really couldn't predict where this was going to go. I thought this was going to be another one of those salad Shakespearean comedies that has all these different elements and just ends in this mass marriage. I could not have been more unprepared for what's about to happen. So he sails off to this other kingdom in Greece. He meets this king and saves their kingdom by giving them food when they're in the middle of this famine. He then sails off. He marries another woman who is the daughter of this other Greek king, and they have a child on the Mediterranean Sea. The woman passes away, or seems to pass away during childbirth, and so the sailors throw her body in a casket off the ship. The casket winds up on the shore, somebody opens it, and realizes that she's still alive, and so she becomes this temple priestess to Diana. Meanwhile, Pericles leaves his daughter in the care of that king and queen that he gave grain to before in the previous acts, and they get really jealous of her beauty because their daughter is not as celebrated as Pericles' daughter is. And so they also hire an assassin to kill Pericles' daughter. Her name's Marina. They hire an assassin to kill Marina. The assassin fails, and Marina ends up owned by these two. Well, she ends up basically being forced into prostitution, but her morality is so good that she manages to convince everyone that she's sold to reform in their ways, and this makes her handlers really freaking mad because they thought they were selling her off as a prostitute, and she somehow like morally reforms everyone they sell her off to. This results in her eventually being returned to Pericles, and the dead wife also reunites with Pericles after he hears a rumor that she's there. Really, what I think this play is building towards is the scene where this king, Pericles, Prince Pericles, thinks that his wife and daughter are dead, and yet suddenly in Act 5 they are not. They are revealed to be alive, and this actor has this tremendous overwhelming feeling of joy, relief, satisfaction. That's core to really all Shakespearean comedies, is that rather than every character getting married, it's the realization that someone that you thought was dead the entire time is actually not dead. This is also a kind of Shakespearean trope. It's present in The Winter's Tale, it's present in Twelfth Night. It's a really feel-good kind of moment. I think what doesn't work about Pericles, though, is that the plot is so wild that we actually don't get to see Pericles really grieve either of these two people. Or, I mean, we do, but it's not quite as strong as what it could be. I think the idea of having a false tragedy and then ending it by bringing a character back to life is something that in a play like, say, The Winter's Tale is done really well. And in this play is not done nearly as effectively. I think it's just so messy and so strange. It's so wild with its various different settings. And I guess it also functions as a bit of an adventure play. Like, understandably, a Shakespearean audience would not have gone to all of these different settings. And so being able to see all these on stage is probably exciting in its own way. I do think that the performance of this might be more exciting than reading the script, but the experience of reading the script is a bit shallow. Like, I think that emotionally this could have been a lot stronger and a lot better. It is also one of the shorter plays, but just all these random strange things just happen. Like, I haven't explained even all the weird stuff that goes on in this play. It's so extreme, and yet it's so quick and messy. I would give it a 2 out of 5. Like, I think that going forward, if I'm going to read all the Shakespeare plays, there are going to be some that are not good, and this one I would say is not really good. This one's, yeah, it reminds me of better plays. Like, you see, the entire time I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about all the other better plays that do parts of this play. So, yeah, 2 out of 5. Alright, and there are my books of July. Apologies for a fairly underwhelming month. Aside from, weirdly enough, the Booker Prize winners, everything else, it's hard for me to get excited about. Hopefully next month we read some new things, some different things. But as always, thank you for joining, and I will see everyone next month.